sign me up for the Christian Jubilee. Write my name on the roll. I've been changed since the Lord has lifted me. I want to be ready when Jesus comes.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the short course of biblical interpretation. And this week we're going to be talking about source criticism. So let me get you to our quote for our time together from Pierre Bourdieu. We've discussed there's only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, and the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more different eyes we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will be our concept of this thing, our objectivity. And I hope that you've all begun to see we're only on our third methodology, biblical criticism methodology, but already I think we're beginning to see how different methods are used to bring out different interpretations and different details in the texts that we're looking at in this sacred biblical text that is our has been passed down to us. Now, for this specific source criticism, I have this quote for you. It's from Noah's Ark. It's Genesis 6:19-20. And again, like the last couple weeks, this will come up later. So it says, "You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive." All right, so we're familiar with that, right?
Yes.
When we go do Bible school, we go, Noah, he built them, and narky, right? And he brought on the animals. He brought them on by twosies, elephants and kangaroos.
Yeah.
Okay. So our key terms for this week are harmonizing the text, synchronic versus diachronic, continuities, discontinuities, and coherence, sources, of course it's source criticism, so that makes sense, composite authorship and authorial voice, and then the last one is documentary hypothesis. And I have slides for each one of these, so if you don't have time to write them all down, don't worry. Each slide will come to each one of these.
Okay.
So let's look at harmonizing the text. So in harmonizing the text, do you guys still have my PowerPoint up? Are you still looking at my PowerPoint?
Yes, it's there.
Yes.
Okay. So harmonizing the text. So modern scholar Joel Baden was trying to revive source criticism. He's actually a current scholar. He's actually he's a pretty young guy. He works at Yale. And he says that the history of interpretation has always been about reading the text as a whole unified text. And what this means is that we harmonize the text when there are disharmonies or disagreements. That could be a location, it could be a name, a punishment. It could even be, and this happens sometimes, a theological principle. So when you're looking at a story, especially in the Pentateuch, you could get one theological principle in one place and then in another place get a completely different theological principle that counteracts that one. And what happens in the human brain is that we make things fit together because somewhere in the tradition it was assumed that the whole of the Pentateuch was written by one person. So all those discontinuities, we harmonize them. We make them make sense. So the rabbis of Jesus' time assumed that the one writer was Moses. And most interpreters since then, until modern times, until about the 18th century, held that belief as well. what a source critic does is that a source critic recognizes that when you read the text as a human literary production, that means humans actually wrote it, and not just as a sacred text where you have to have like, it was Moses who wrote it. We have to have that faith, otherwise my entire religious identity is shot. Right? If you read it as a human literary production, then there are all kinds of unresolvable problems, which most of interpretation history has done mental gymnastics to solve. So let's look at this. Let's look at this text that I have for us for harmonizing the text, and I'm going to explain this. So Genesis 37, you'll see that I've highlighted certain portions of it. This is when Joseph is being sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Genesis 37. It begins at verse 25. It says, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. And remember, Ishmael is Isaac's half-brother.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So he's not going to make the same mistake as Cain and Abel, right? So, next verse, or 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So I missed one of these. I didn't do Ishmaelites in verse 28. But so does this bother anybody?
You say bother. What are you referencing?
Well, so you're not bothered by it.
By the fact of him being what? I want to make certain that I'm on the same page with you.
Yeah.
By being sold by his brother?
Nope. Look at what I've highlighted.
Okay, so when the Midianite
You
merchants
see
came
any
by,
discrepancy?
Mm-hmm.
okay,
They were going to sell him to the Ishmaelites, but it looks like the Midianites bought him.
Right.
Are they the
Right.
same people?
So this is the question, right? So
Right.
I put this in harmonizing the text because for just about 2,000 years, every person who has interpreted this, wise sage and regular Joe Schmo on the street, has
Mhm.
always said these Ishmaelites and Midianites must be the same group because they're in the same 5 verses or same, 25 to 36. So the same 11 verses, they're in the same story, and they seem to be used interchangeably.
Right.
So people have said they must be the same group. And yet they have different names.
yes, that is interesting.
So people, you can do easy mental gymnastics and say, well, Ishmaelites is one way to refer to people who are also from Midian, and so sometimes they're called Midianites. But again, that's a way to harmonize the text.
Mm.
So when we see something like this and we try to make it work, that's harmonizing the text. And this is going to come up later when we start talking about why the source critics think that they can see different sources having written the biblical text. So I just want you to keep this in mind. We're not going to solve this one.
Okay.
So let's go to synchronic versus diachronic. So this simply refers to the time of writing. What scholars found is that there was an assumption in the early interpreters that the whole Bible was written at one time. So if it's written by one author, it's written at one time. And that's called synchronic. It means it all happens, like we have synchronicity, right? It's all happening at the same time.
All right.
However, what these unresolvable problems seem to show was a long tradition of biblical editing and change over time. And that's diachronic. That means it's happening over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
What they ended up doing was looking systematically into the continuities and discontinuities of the text these unresolvable problems and trying to figure out what could explain such a disharmony like Genesis 37 and other disharmonies that are actually more major than just were they Ishmaelites or Midianites. And we'll look at a couple of those later. Which leads us into talking about continuities and discontinuities, because that's how a source critic makes their case. So continuities, discontinuities, and coherence, these are pieces of text that either agree with each other or disagree with each other. They could be minute details, they could be large details, they could be something significant to the narrative, or they could just be some small little detail. Sometimes, as I said earlier, they might even be a staple theological concept. So something like, you are to sacrifice on an altar that has horns. That's one solid rock. Or you're never to sacrifice on an altar like that. You need to sacrifice on an altar with no horns, and that's built by individual pieces of stone. And this happens. So you might have two different theological concepts of what kind of altar you're allowed to use for sacrifices, all within the first 5 books of the Bible that were ostensibly written by one person. So what scholars look for especially are doublets, things that repeat. And some of these doublets show continuity, i.e. they have a coherence and a consistency. So we talked a little bit last week about Genesis 12, 20, and 26. That was the sister-wife tales. Now, they tell the same story 3 times, and in Genesis 26, it's now, instead of Abraham and Sarah, it's Isaac. Okay. And so it looks like it could be a discontinuity. Why would they tell this story 3 times in a row? And yet, what a person like Joel Baden will say about this is, he'll say that while we're looking at these kind of possible discontinuities, especially things that repeat, this one actually could make sense, because all 3 of them happen in different places and at different times, and they don't disrupt the overall narrative of the patriarchs. So Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah are in Egypt. Genesis 20, and Pharaoh is the king. Genesis 20, Abraham and Sarah are in a place called Gerar, and the king is Abimelech. Remember, we talked last week about Abimelech being the son of a king, just kind of this kind of title rather than a name. And then in Genesis 26, it's Isaac and Abimelech. And so what he'll say is, it looks like it could be a discontinuity, but actually it could just be a repeated trick that seems to work over and over again to get Abraham and Isaac money. Another one that we see a couple of times is, we wonder about why the leadership and why the certain people in the wilderness are not allowed to enter the promised land. So in Numbers 20, there's the miracle of Moses bringing water out of the rock. And at the end of that story, God says to Moses, by the way, you're not going to enter into the promised land because these people have been testing me and you didn't do things right. So you and Aaron are going to die before you get to the promised land. But in Numbers 14, in the episode of the spies, they're spying out the promised land, and Moses had sent spies in, including Caleb and Joshua. And all of the spies who went into the promised land came back and said, it's not real good. They're really strong. We shouldn't invade. We shouldn't go into the promised land. And because of that, they're told that the wilderness generation would not enter the promised land. So then we ask, why are they telling 2 different reasons for the elders and the people not being able to enter the promised land? is this a contradiction? That they would have two different reasons, that God would give two different reasons why certain people can't enter the promised land. Now, maybe, but on the one hand, Numbers 20 is only about Moses and Aaron, and Numbers 14 is only about the older generation who are traveling through the wilderness, people 20 and above. So they're actually different groups. So there are different reasons for the different groups not going into the promised land. So those actually might not be discontinuities. But what about more concrete discontinuities? So in Genesis 27, that's where Jacob gets Esau's blessing from Isaac. So Isaac is an old man, he's blind, he's laying basically seemingly on his deathbed. And so they go in and say, one of us needs to get this blessing. And you'll remember that Jacob tricked Esau out of the blessing. So here we have Isaac on his deathbed, and yet the story about Isaac actually dying doesn't happen till Genesis 35. And people have pointed out that the time span between Genesis 27 and Genesis 35 is about 21 years. So there's a question: how has somebody on their deathbed survived 21 years? That seems a little strange. The other one, and I'm going to show this one on the next slide, because this is, I think, it's kind of one of the most interesting ones. And this is Noah, and this brings up our quote from today. So you'll see the first one is Genesis 6, 19 through 20, which is what we read. You'll gather two of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground. But then immediately after, so Genesis 6 ends in verse 21 or 22, and at the beginning of Genesis 7, God says it all over again to Noah. And this time he says, take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. Now, do you see why this would cause a few questions? Does everybody kind of see how that changed?
Mhm.
Well, see the change, but
Yeah, so these two things happen within 5 verses of each other.
Mhm.
So in Genesis 6, God says, bring 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, and every kind of creature. And in Genesis 7, he says, oh no, actually, the clean animals bring 7, and the unclean animals bring 1 pair. So then we could either harmonize this and say, we could harmonize the text and say, actually, Genesis 7 is just giving a little bit more particular detail. Or what source critics are going to say is, these are 2 different authors that have 2 different agendas.
So that is why you sometimes read that Moses may not have been the author of the first 5 books.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
So source criticism is trying to make the case that there are multiple authors and multiple, not just traditions, but multiple authors who wrote texts that were all then incorporated into the first 5 books of the Bible.
Right.
Which leads us into sources, composite authorship, and authorial voice. So Julius Wellhausen, he's the father of 19th century source criticism. Now, source criticism started in the 18th century, but early on, they were just trying to delineate between 2 sources, really, this J source and E source, which I'll explain a little bit more. But the only difference that they saw, they weren't looking at continuities and discontinuities. They were looking at the difference between when a certain passage called God Yahweh and when a certain passage called God El or Elohim. And that's the only difference they made. as they went along, people decided that that Deuteronomy was its own author because it's so different from the first four books. And then later people decided that there was a P source, a priestly source, that also had a hand in creating the first four books. And so let's just talk about these for a second, because Wellhausen and now a century after Wellhausen, there are more people who are trying to kind of reestablish source criticism, or kind of its bona fides, make it a stronger case for it. So the J source, or the Yahwist, Wellhausen thought was a 10th century BCE writer. He thought that this writer lived during Solomon's reign as king. He uses the Tetragrammaton, which is Yahweh, for God, presents God anthropomorphically. That means God is like almost like a human being with divine powers. So God gets angry, God gets sad, God asks questions, and those kinds of things. This writer also, according to Wellhausen, lifts up Judahite sites and traditions like Mount Sinai. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about how the giving of the law in one passage says Mount Sinai, and in another passage says Mount Horeb. And this J source is linked with the Mount Sinai tradition. The E source is called the Elohist, and Wellhausen said that he was a 9th century BCE writer, and this is after the northern and southern kingdom split. So after Solomon, 1 or 2 generations after Solomon, the unified kingdom, which is all the tribes, split into 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Israel's the northern kingdom. And this Elohist, he said, lived in that northern kingdom after the split. And he uses El or Elohim to refer to God, sometimes El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. He cares about prophecy, about visions and dreams, about angelic messengers, and he lifts up northern traditions like Mount Horeb. The D source, according to Wellhausen, the Deuteronomist, was an 8th to 7th century BCE author, culminating in Josiah's reforms in 622 BCE. So when you're in the book of Kings and you get to Josiah, there's a whole chapter about how they found a book of the law that had been sitting in the temple, and it had been lost for generations, and all of a sudden they found it. And King Josiah had them read it out loud to all of Israel, he said. They gathered all of Israel to the temple, and he read the book of the law. And then he made religious reforms, and he was one of the only kings in the book of Kings that was regarded as a good king. All the rest of them were like, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This D source, some of the themes for the Deuteronomist is the chosenness of Israel. Conditional covenant, that means when God says, like, if you obey my statutes and commandments, then I will. It's a conditional covenant. He's really adamant about faithfulness, especially to the covenant, faithfulness to God. Care for the needy, the widow. Those things are tend to be Deuteronomical. And then a centralized cult or centralized worship. So that means Jerusalem is the center of the kind of like religious universe, and the temple in Jerusalem as the central location for all worship. And then the last source is the P source, the priestly source. And Wellhausen said he's a 6th to 5th century BCE writer. He's post-exilic and he's temple-based. So remember we talked about how the southern kingdom, so Judah, was taken over by Babylon in 586 BC. And then they came back from Babylon. They were brought back when the Persians took over. And they sent a lot of the people back to Jerusalem. So they tried to rebuild the temple, the second temple. And they created this kind of priestly caste and this priestly religion that was based in Jerusalem. So that's what it means post-exilic temple-based, is that they assume that these priests were people who were being paid to be priests in a kind of central worshiping location, and they had the means to copy and write texts. So their main goals are to solve conflicts between the Babylonian exiles who are returning and then the people who didn't get taken captive. So when the Babylonians came, they only really took the rich people. They took all the rich people and the problematic people and all the people who were kind of too poor to leave. They just left them in the land. They weren't worried about those folks. So when the people came back from Babylon, there was a lot of strife over, well, 70 years has passed and each of them have been doing their own thing. How do we recognize that we're all one group of people? And so that's one of the reasons the priests are kind of chiming in on these patriarchal stories, is because they're trying to make everything seem like we're all one people, that we all believe in kind of one patriarchal past, and so we all share one identity. So not unsurprisingly, the priests, when they're writing, they're concerned with priestly things. They're concerned with priestly duties and priestly authority, like who's allowed to be a priest. They're worried about liturgy. They're worried about sacrifice, laws, shrines, and all those kind of things that go along with priests. So actually, if I go back to this slide of Genesis 7, when you see something that says there were 7 pairs of every clean animal, and you have 1 pair of every unclean animal, that's a priestly distinction. Because what are clean and unclean animals used for or not used for? Does anybody know? I'll just
I don't know
spare
which
us
one
the
they do
way-
to, but it's eating and sacrifice, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's what I would think, eating and sacrifice.
Right, exactly. So when you're talking about clean or unclean animals, you're talking about sacrifice. And so this was really an important detail for a priestly writer to put in. They wanted you to know that Noah himself was within this kind of priestly pre-heritage, and he was thinking about these things, that these kind of concerns went all the way back to Noah. So they wrote that and made sure it was in the text, that Noah took more of the clean animals than he did of the unclean animals. Okay, so the last one is the documentary hypothesis, and all of this that I've been discussing is commonly known as the documentary hypothesis. And what this means is that source criticism is called that because we have this J, E, P, and D sources, and source critics think that these were 4 independent documents, and that these 4 documents lie behind the final text of the 5 books of the Bible. So when we looked at form and tradition critics, they were not thinking about documents, they were thinking about oral tradition, right? So source critics say there were 4 documents that somebody came and put together. One was a priestly document, one was a Deuteronomist document, one was a Yahwist document, and one was an Elohistic document. Okay, so there are, of course, some objections to source criticism. As we saw last week, the idea behind source criticism, just like form and tradition criticism, was trying to take modern 19th century ideas of scientific inquiry and apply them to the Bible. The goal was not to take the Bible just at face value, but to see if we could learn something about the society that created the Bible text by looking at the text itself. So, in some ways, as I said last week, I should have discussed source criticism before the other 2. And the main reason is that Julius Wellhausen, the most famous source critical scholar, he lived before and influenced the scholars we talked about last week. So Von Rad, Noth, and Gunkel. But on the other hand, those authors for form and tradition, they were looking for the ancient traditions, not documents. They were looking for strands of tradition in the oral tradition. The sources, though, that Wellhausen was looking for, he's looking for actually people who are writing something. So you know, Wellhausen lived before them, but also the era that he's looking at is one generation removed from the oral tradition. So that's why it's okay to look at it this to kind of have done source criticism later. Okay, so originally these sources were seen as singular creative authors. We talked about synchronic. They're each a singular author that lived at a singular time and wrote the whole text. But later scholars have questioned this. So our form and tradition scholars, they relied on source criticism, but they thought that the sources were not so creative. They thought that these J, E, P, and D were just regurgitating oral tradition that they received from their culture. They didn't think they were making anything up. More modern scholars have seen editorial layers or diachronic layers, right? That within each source there might be editing that happened, and so over the course of time they might have changed. Meaning that there might be multiple layers of P, there might be multiple layers of D, there might be multiple layers of J. In the 1970s, our good friend John Van Seters, who critiqued form and tradition criticism, is one of many who also critiqued source criticism. And for Van Seters, he said that many scholars see repetition as discontinuity, by which a new authorial voice might be recognized. So in other words, he says when some people see repetition, they see it as discontinuity, and maybe this is a new author. But he says that might be doubtful because biblical authors use repetition on a regular basis for emphasis. So if you look at the Psalms, the second line almost always repeats and emphasizes something from the first line. So then when we look at something like Genesis 17, while some might see discontinuity in the inclusion of both the promise of many children to Abraham and the promise of one heir, those are two different traditions. So Abraham is promised, children as bountiful as the stars, as many as the stars, but really what he really wants is his one individual son, Isaac. So this looks like it might be a contradiction, that how can it say Abraham is going to have thousands, maybe millions of children, but really also the promise has to do with just this child, Isaac. And what Van Seters says is that the priestly source often goes from broad category to particular case. So from multitude to individual. And so that's not actually a discontinuity. What I will say is that no scholar doubts that there was diachronic editing and composition, like writing, that happened to the text. The real argument is, how do we discover an authorial voice? How do we tell the difference between sources? And how can we go about proving when they were writing and how they influenced one another? So Wellhausen said these guys are from the 10th century, the 9th century, the 7th century, and the 6th century. But how do we know that? Okay. Oh, I give myself a little shout out here at the bottom. The other thing is, what happens if scholars disagree in delineating what source is in a given text? And we'll look at this. We're going to look at Joel Baden. I'm going to look a little bit at the kind of thing that I wrote where I disagree with Joel Baden about Exodus 16 and Numbers 11. So really intelligent scholars can look at the same text and say, well, this is this source and this is this source. And the other one looks at them and says, you're wrong. This is this source and this is this source. So there's even dispute among source critics about what source wrote what. Okay. So again, this is the point, right? No scholar doubts that there were sources of some kind. There were writers, there were editors, but many disagree on whether these constituted individual self-contained documents that were mashed together to create the Pentateuch. So Joel Baden essentially says that. He says there were 4 distinct things that were brought together all at the same time. But some other scholars say that the Yahwist is the base text and everything else was added onto it. So there's a lot of disagreement about that. So let's get to our application section, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for this, which is why I kind of got through the first part fairly quickly. So, I promised it would be Star Wars night. I like to bring in stuff from our culture and see how we can apply this. So this character in Star Wars, his name is Cassian Andor. And last year or the year before, there was an entire television series just based on this character. And as you can see here, Cassian Andor at one point, for a large part of the series is in prison. So Cassian Andor is a loner. He tries to make ends meet on his home planet, which is occupied by the Empire, and he lives among an oppressed people. And he gets caught up in a scheme to sell stolen goods, and he's captured. So he's sent to this prison where he spends a long time on a type of chain gang making parts for the Death Star. I hope we know what the Death Star, and if not, just bear with me.
Oh, no.
But eventually he escapes. So he escapes from this prison. Actually, it's this big, it's on this watery planet. So once he escapes, like the only thing that he can go to is like there's this huge ocean, and the prison is just this kind of like almost like an oil rig in the middle of an ocean. And so once he and all the prisoners escape, it takes him, he has to figure out how they're going to get off the planet. Okay. So this is the Andor series. Now, several years ago, I think it was 2014 or something like that, there was a movie called Rogue One, and it was a standalone movie, but it happens within the Star Wars universe. And I don't know if you can see this right here, on the left side, that's the same character, Cassian Andor.
Mm-hmm.
He plays a big part in that movie. Why do I bring this up? So in the narrative, the prison scene happens, even though the TV series was written after this movie was written, in the narrative, the grand scheme of the Star Wars narrative, the prison scene happens before Rogue One. So I write here several years later in the narrative. And in Rogue One, Cassian Andor has joined the rebels against the Empire. And in this movie, he's trying to help the main character find out details about how to destroy the Death Star that he apparently had just been helping to build. But they got caught and they got thrown into a jail cell. So, and this is the exchange that he has. So this character right here on the right says, well, I've been in worse cages. To which Cassian Andor says, this is a first for me.
Hmm.
Do you see the narrative discontinuity?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
If he spent months or years in prison, why would he say that this is the first time he's been in a cage?
Mhm.
Now, I don't need to tell you that the internet is full of all kinds of theories that try to harmonize this text. Let me see. Let me just read you a couple. So they say, well, he lies about fighting on Mimban too, wherever that is, remember? Luthen has to call out that he was a cook, not a fighter, and he survived by running away, not by being a fighter. Cassian is a pathological liar. And then he says, kind of meanly, you are a continuity robot. We talked about continuities and discontinuities.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else says, there were quite explicitly in the first prison no locked doors, so it's not actually a cage. So when he says, I have not been in a cage like this, he's saying. Another person says, that prison had no bars. This one has bars. And I'm not going to keep reading because I think you get the point.
Mm-hmm.
that people on the internet, just like people who read the Bible, go, there's a way to explain this that can harmonize both things. And it's funny because those same people who are on the internet probably look at us when we try and harmonize texts in the Bible and say, why would you do that? It's obviously this is dumb.
Right.
So the question of the hour is, are there different sources behind these two texts?
Mhm.
And I'll just let you know that what happened is Rogue One, supposedly several years before the Andor series in the Star Wars narrative arc, was actually written and filmed 7 years before the Andor series. There were also different writers, i.e. sources or documents. Thus, a small unresolvable detail got into the narrative. And these writers, I had their names written down somewhere, but I don't know what I did with it. But in any case, so there are different writers for each of these, movies or these series, and so you expect some slippage like that, something to fall through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at it from a biblical perspective, we're like, oh, we see it happening here. Yeah, you have different writers, and they're in the same universe. They're telling stories from the same place. They're telling a different story. They're augmenting stories that have come before. And oops, we got a small detail wrong.
Mhm.
Now, how about this? So that could actually support the idea of source criticism, right?
Mhm.
We see it happening here, that there are different sources. It's possible that when we look at discontinuities in the Bible, we're also looking at different sources.
Mm-hmm.
But how about this? This is a poem called A Warm Day in Winter. It says, sunshine on the meadows, greenness on the way. That's the blessed reason I sing all the day. Look here, what you axing? What makes me so merry? 'Spect to see me sighing when it's warm in February? So we notice things, right? As good form critics, we notice we're reading a poem, right?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And we notice the vernacular, the language that it's using,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that tells us a little bit about where we think it might have come from, who's speaking,
Right.
right? What their socioeconomic status is, what their power relation, their relationship with power and authority is. Now let's look at this. This is a poem called Sympathy by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Many of us have heard this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maya Angelou wrote a book based on her feelings about this poem, right? Her memoir. I know what the caged bird feels, alas, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume from its chalice steals. I know what the caged bird feels.
Mhm.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Paul Laurence Dunbar is one of the first nationally recognized African American poets of the 20th century. Now, when we look at these two poems, would we ever in a million years think that they were both written by Paul Laurence Dunbar?
No, absolutely not.
Right? One of them we would assume what is probably an unattributed song by an enslaved person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then we have this kind of like high register, high stylistic, it's even, I mean, it's got rhyme in it. It's kind of using an elevated vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. It's eloquent.
It's so the poetic idea of what a caged bird feels,
Mhm.
right? And yet they were both written by Paul Laurence Dunbar.
I was gonna say they were.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what does this tell us about what the kind of people who say source criticism might not might be out of its depth. Because if we have text, say we didn't have Paul Laurence Dunbar's name associated with either of these, we would never look at these two if they came into the same document, if they were in the same text. We would never look at them and say this was the same author,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Right. Right.
And so what limits source criticism is that very good authors can change everything about how they write, depending on what they're writing about
It's true.
and what they're trying to get across.
Right.
Very true.
And who they're trying to write to. They're
Who
Right.
all-
they're
And
trying to
then-
write to.
Yeah.
And their circumstances.
And and completely their circumstances.
Yeah.
So
are
we
different.
could be falsely like led to believe that two parts of the Bible that seem discontinuous with one another are written by two different people, but unknowingly we might be wrong.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
you know, sometimes Mark Twain writes a country bumpkin with a country bumpkin twang.
Sure does. Mhm.
You know, there's this, I didn't have this in here, but my sister-in-law gave me this book by a Portuguese author named Fernando Pessoa. He lived in the early 20th century. He wrote under 72 or more pseudonyms during his lifetime.
Wow.
Every single one of them a different character.
Mm.
Every single one of them a different diction. Every single one of them a different job, a different socioeconomic status. And he wrote poems as these people. He wrote narratives as these people. He wrote diary entries as these people.
Mm.
So if they hadn't been found in his particular trunk after he had died, he had them in a kind of like a chest. And they found he'd written stuff and people knew him. He was a literary critic and he'd written some other stuff under his own name. But when he died, they found millions upon millions of words of these different like private writings as he'd done, where he was 72 or 73 different people.
Wow.
All of them completely idiosyncratic.
Hmm.
Now, if you just found that and he didn't have writings with his friends saying, oh, this is how I feel about multiple personalities or about being a writer, you would have thought that he just had collected the writings of 72 different people.
Hmm.
And then you'd say there were 72 sources when it was really just one person. So on the one case, the Star Wars case, we see why source criticism could be useful, because it could explain mild discrepancies, or it could explain why there are differences that we can't that are unresolvable. But we also have to be careful that we're not looking and seeing things that aren't there. Now let's get to our biblical case. All right. And this is where I'm going to take Joel Baden on a little bit. So I wrote a paper, as you remember, may or may not remember, last summer I went to Salzburg, Austria, and presented a paper at the International Society of Biblical Literature.
Right.
And in that paper, I looked at what Joel Baden, a source critic, said about Exodus 16 and Numbers 11, and I said I see it differently. So let's read these texts. So Exodus 16, and we're just going to read the pertinent parts. I mean, it's all pertinent, but these are the ones that I can make a kind of strong case for in the shortest amount of time, because there are too many details to go through all of them. But it says, the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And then it fills out what it is a little bit later. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. And manna in Hebrew means what is it? So it's kind of an etymological joke. They say
Mm.
manna, and like what is it? And so that's what its name ended up being. So let's look at Numbers 11. This is going to be a doublet. So it's going to be a repetition of this story. So Numbers 11. The rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." The manna was like coriander seed and looked like resin. The people went around gathering it and then ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot or made it into loaves, and it tasted like something made with olive oil. When the dew settled on the camp at night, the manna also came down. Okay, so the reason I bring this up is the discontinuity that we see. And there are a couple minor details difference, and there are a couple of continuities too, right? They both say that the manna tasted like coriander, which sounds pretty good. But the discontinuity is, why do the people need manna in Numbers 11 if they got manna in Exodus 16? Or conversely, Joel Baden would say, why do people ask for meat when they've already been given meat in Exodus 16? Right? So Exodus 16, it said they got manna and quail. And here they say, they recognize, we have manna, but they pretend like are they pretending that they didn't get meat and now they're asking for meat? Or why are they asking for meat when they already got it in Exodus 16? They recognize this in the narrative. They recognize that they already got the bread. But the author of Numbers 11 didn't know that whoever wrote Exodus 16 had already put meat in that miracle. And that's why they're asking for meat here. So that's the discontinuity. So what Joel Baden says is that Exodus 16:11 through 13 is the priestly source, but the manna portion is the J source. So he sees P here because the narrative goes into collecting the manna for 6 days, but getting double portion on the 6th day so that they don't have to work on the 7th. And that's the priestly concern to make sure that the people are keeping the Sabbath holy. Just like God did in Genesis 1, right? God created for 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. That's also a priestly source, according to source critics. It's concerned with the Sabbath. All of creation even goes with this paradigm of the 6 days working, 7th day rest. That's a priestly concern. He says that Numbers 11 is the J source because it continues the manna story from Exodus 16, but didn't know that the meat had already been given. So he sees the two narratives, if meat was removed from Exodus 16, as one continuous source. So if you took the priestly part, the meat part, out of Exodus 16, he says it's the J source writing both stories. And that makes sense, right? Because if you take the meat out of Exodus 16, then you have a manna story. And then Numbers 11 starts with, we have manna, but we don't really like meat. And that would make sense to have that kind of narrative arc. In my paper, given to the International SBL, I made a similar but a little bit different case. I made the case based on discontinuities in a typical motif structure. So not looking at sources, but looking at how the whole narrative works as a miracle motif. There's 6 miracles in the wilderness, and they all follow the same pattern. And when you look at how these two how and where these two don't fit the pattern, you find additions by other hands. So you can also look in the syntactical structure of the sentences containing meat and quail. And when you look at the sentences and how the syntactical structure works, you could actually take you could take the meat part out of everywhere that meat is listed, and it wouldn't disrupt the flow of the narrative. And then there's the fact that whoever wrote Numbers 11 had no idea that meat had already been given. So what I said is that the meat and quail was an intrusion on the narrative of Exodus 16. What Baden says is that meat was the priestly source, and that the priestly source intruded on the otherwise it was a J source. So I agree with Bader in that, but while Bader calls the meat a priestly intrusion, I think this doesn't explain why the rest of the priestly material in Exodus 16 never mentions meat and quail again in its theological narrative about the Sabbath. So in order to understand this, if you look at the rest of Exodus 16 after the part that we looked at, once you get to verse 15 and you get to what Joel Baden would call the priestly source, it starts talking about this. They gathered the bread for 6 days, and on the 6th day they gathered double so that they wouldn't. All that whole part comes after verse 15, and meat is never mentioned again. So why would a priest who's going to write this next part that only had to do with bread, what good would it do for them to insert meat into the story before that if they weren't even going to talk about it? So that's why I think he makes a good argument about the meat, but I just don't think that source criticism is the best way to necessarily go about solving that problem. So he and I disagree, and I think I'm right. Works at Yale, and I don't. But so his is source criticism, and mine is literary, and mine is kind of more literary criticism. And yet I still assume that there are sources behind the text. So I would still say that yes, the end of Exodus 16 is a priestly source. It deals with this idea of keeping the Sabbath holy. That's a priestly concern. But I'm more likely than Joel Baden to say that actually within each source, there's continuing progression of editing that's happening. And that there might be actually more than just J, E, P, and D. There might be other people who have other concerns. So for me, the addition of meat to the bread in this chapter actually mirrors what you see in the original Passover. Remember when the people are trying to leave Egypt, and Pharaoh is all the firstborn, the night that the firstborn are killed,
Right.
and the people are supposed to bake bread so they can carry it with them. They're also supposed to sacrifice a lamb so that they can celebrate. And so you see, and there's a morning and evening dichotomy that happens there. And so my suggestion is that a later editor came in and said, we have to, in this story, have meat and bread because that's what the Exodus is based on, and morning and evening. And those things travel together, and they really wanted this section to mirror the Passover. And so that's what I think is going on. When you get to a source critic, they're just going to say, this is P, this is J. And maybe there's a reason, but they would never be able to make that kind of extra link because they think they're independent sources, just one writer at one time writing it all down. So that's source criticism. That was a lot, wasn't it?
Was
Yes,
a
it
lot.
was.
So does anybody have any questions or any clarifications?
I think it's coming together and making more sense to me now. Now that, I know about source criticism and looking at the last couple of weeks where we talked about form traditions, I think now it's beginning to make sense to me how it has all evolved.
Yeah. Yeah, how it's all kind of building off one another, isn't it?
Right.
Which is great because that means that we have this system that seems to be working. But the bad thing about it is that we've been in culture as scholars, we've been enculturated into looking at the Bible in pretty much one way, and
Exactly.
it's really hard to get out of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard. It's really hard to get out of that. Number one, because as a scholar, or like even for me as a PhD student, I have to go into this and know all of this stuff and be able to write in this way to prove that I deserve to be in academia.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to internalize these things in order to get credit for
Mhm.
having knowledge about the Bible.
Mhm.
But insofar as there are problems with this received way, that's really difficult. I mean, the first source critics, Wellhausen, I think, was really worried. He mostly taught seminarians
Mm.
in Germany, and he was really worried because everybody thought Moses wrote this. Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, except for the part where it talks about him dying. Joshua added that, just those 7 lines, because
Hmm.
Moses literally couldn't have written that. But
Mhm.
Wellhausen worried that he was teaching things to these guys who had thousands, like, almost 2,000 years of tradition saying that Moses wrote this book. And he thought he was going to be destroying people's faith by looking into these things. And so he also, when he was doing what he was doing as this kind of radical, kind of revolutionary change of biblical interpretation, he probably was in the same thing I am. He has to know the things that came before so that he can start working on his kind of new paradigms.
Mhm.
So these, I think, may be the most didactic. I think next week we're going to be getting into redaction criticism.
Mhm.
And you'll see how this kind of redaction criticism naturally flows out of all of these things we've been talking about, especially the last 2 weeks. Because redaction criticism says that the final form of the text was put together by a redactor or an editor. And so they're kind of like trying to put a stamp on the end of the writing process, whereas what we've been talking about is the beginning of the writing process. How did all these things get pulled together in the first place? And redaction is going to look at how did they get completed the way we have them.
Mhm.
And after that, we're going to get into some really cool things. And those are going to be like reader response theory. So it's like, what do I take out of the text? Feminism, which is really, really a phenomenal way to read the text. These are all places. Remember, we talked about the difference between decoding the text and interpreting the text
Right.
in the first session. So when we do things like look for sources, we're trying to decode the text.
Mhm.
We're trying to find something that is inherent inside the text that we're able to kind of piece together. And we're going to start getting in the next couple weeks into more interpretive things, which is, okay, that stuff is all important, but what does this mean for me?
Mhm.
And so we're going to be getting into those post-colonial, which will be really interesting. And so I'm really excited to see where this goes. And I'm going to sign off for now, and we will see you all next week.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Sign me up for the Christian Jubilee. Write my name on the roll. I've been changed since the Lord has lifted me. I want to be ready when Jesus comes. Oh, change since the Lord has lifted me.